All right. Thanks to everybody who's joining online. We're just going to wait a few minutes to let everyone join. I know there can be technical issues with people joining Teams, and this is the first time we've organized a webinar through Teams. So if there are any issues, please let me know, and I can try to help. But as I said, we'll wait a few minutes and wait for more people to join before we get into the topic. All right, great. We're getting lots of people joining. Nice to see everyone. The automatic setting on Teams is to have, for the webinar, is to mute audience mics. And so I think for the sake of simplicity, I think I might just keep it for audience members to have their mics muted for the presentation section. And then once we get to the Q&A, I can switch it to allow people to speak. And so I think there is a Q&A function in the Teams chat there on the side. I don't know how it shows up for audience members, but there's a chat function and a Q&A function. So if you can try to use the Q&A function to submit any questions that you have, and then as I say, as we get into the discussion section, we can unmute people and have more of a general discussion. But I'm not sure, as I said, this is my first time organizing a webinar through Teams, so bear with me as I figure that out. But I should be able to unmute individual participants. And so we may have to get people to raise their hand virtually if they want to speak. But as I said, there's the chat function and the Q&A. So we've got a few different routes if people either want to speak out loud or write it down. We've got a variety of different options for people. So we have a good number of people registered today. There were 44 people registered the last I checked, and we're currently at about 16 attendees have signed in so far. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes before we get into the material proper. But thanks everyone for joining today. I think this will be an interesting discussion. Looking forward to getting to hear what my colleagues are speaking about, but then also hopefully have a discussion with the audience as well. Suppose just as we're getting started, if anyone wants to write in the chat and say where you're joining from or what organization you're with or what drew you to this workshop webinar as a starting point, it might be nice to get to introduce people virtually, and then we can hear a bit more as we get into the discussion section. Great. Hi, Maria. Nice to see you. Aisling and Cian, thanks very much for joining. Nice to see we have people from all over Ireland joining. Very strong start. Oh, wonderful. We have someone joining from Bangladesh. Masoom, thank you very much for joining. Great to have you here. And Anna from Brazil joining from San Francisco. Wow, very international group of people. Lovely. Brian and Linda, Dave, Jeremy, Donal from Fairseas, Ruth. So lovely to have so many people joining from all over Ireland and around the world. I think we will start the presentations now. I think we've got a good number of people signed on, and hopefully a few more people will join as we get going. So I will pass it over to Kat McCann to kick us off.
Okay, hello everyone. So I see so many people from all over Ireland. My name is Kat McCann. I am the Executive Officer for the Irish Social Literacy Network. I see quite a few of our members here. It's nice to see you all. And if there's some members here I haven't yet met, I'm looking forward to meeting you later, sure. For those of you who aren't from Ireland, IOLN, the Irish Social Literacy Network, is a networking body of individuals and organisations dedicated to cultivating and nurturing a sustainable community of social literate citizens on the island of Ireland. All members are from all over the island of Ireland, as evidenced from this talk. We have coastal communities, academics, businesses, public bodies, NGOs. We have representatives from all over the island of Ireland, and we're all dedicated toward pushing or promoting social literacy. Now, I often get asked, what is social literacy, by people who are unfamiliar with the concept, as it does sound like quite a lofty academic one. And it did originally start off as an academic study, but it has progressed over the years. Most recently, it has been about, I would give the 7 principles of social literacy would be like logical reasons as to why the ocean is important to us and our effect in the ocean. And these reasons, logical reasons such as, for example, protecting biodiversity and economy. But in recent years, particularly since 2023, with a study, it is explored, moved towards being more about our cultural ties with the ocean and our marine heritage and like our deep emotional ties with the ocean. And ocean literacy is like why people act for the ocean in a certain way, and people who have these cultural and emotional ties to the ocean will act for the ocean because of those reasons. And this very much ties in with the concept of marine identity. I'm not going to speak on marine identity because Dr. Lindsay West, who's going to speak about this very, very eloquently. So the way this webinar is run is I'm going to give a very short and sweet introduction, and I'm then going to hand you over to Lindsay West. Dr. Lindsay West is a research fellow at the Department of Planning, Queen's University of Belfast. She's working on Horizon Europe-funded Permagon project, which supports the implementation of EU marine policies. Her research focuses on human-ocean relationships, marine biodiversity conservation, and community-led governance. Lindsay is going to speak about the overview of marine identity and its connections to ocean literacy. I'm then going to hand you over to Alex Miller. Alex, who's already been speaking, is a research fellow at the Empower Us project, Horizon Europe initiative, supporting coastal communities in building more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable future. Alex is currently completing a PhD in environmental planning at Queen's University of Belfast. So, like I said, I'm going to keep this short and sweet because we want the bulk of this discussion, we want the bulk of the input on this webinar to come from you, the participants, as we explore ocean literacy and marine identity, what the ocean means to you, and how we can all work together to further this. So I'm going to hand you over to Lindsay now. Lindsay?
Thanks, Kat. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And yeah, Alex, if you could share the slides. There we are. So yeah, today I'm going to just give a brief overview of marine identity. Could you go to the next slide? Yeah, so we might be familiar with the concept of environmental identity, which reflects how individuals perceive themselves in relation to the natural world. So marine identity sort of expands on this concept and refers to the way in which individuals understand themselves in relation to the ocean. So people with a strong marine identity feel that the ocean and the self are interdependent. So therefore, the ocean affects the way that they think about the world, as well as the way they think about themselves. So in this sense, we can understand marine identity as related to the concept of connections with the ocean. We see a lot in the literature about human-ocean connections. But here I want to argue that marine identity is much deeper and more profound than ocean connections. And that's because at the center of marine identity is the self concept. As I said, that relationship between the self and the ocean. So marine identity, it really understands how people perceive themselves in relation to the ocean. Alex, could you go to the next slide, please? And so therefore, it is the answer to the questions, who am I? And how does the ocean shape who I am? And obviously, the answers to these questions can be very emotionally significant. And so therefore, when we talk about marine identity, we really do reflect a lot on the emotional side and the emotional connection to the ocean. So marine identity may be rooted in early experiences and upbringing, or it can develop over time based on social and cultural influences, and also adverse experiences with the ocean. For example, swimming in the sea and the risk of a strong tide, and perhaps these feelings of danger and risk of being in the ocean. So in that way, because of these diverse experiences that people have with the ocean, this can generate very diverse marine identities amongst people living within the same coastal community. So therefore, marine identity is connected with the social political environment, with geographical and historical contexts and locations. And related to that, we must also understand that marine identity, as I sort of just touched on, it can reflect obviously very positive and strong relationships with the ocean. But it is also, marine identity can reflect very precarious relationships with the ocean. For example, people living on low-lying islands that are exposed to rising sea levels. So marine identity is very multifaceted. It's not just about positive feelings and very strong relationships with the ocean. Those relationships can also be related to fear. And also thinking about how relationships can be very positive but also negative. I drew on that example of low-lying islands and the risks of climate change. That also implies that marine identity can be disrupted and can change over time. And that's something that I'm very personally interested in exploring through my research. Next slide, please, Alex. So as Kat mentioned, ocean literacy is recognised as a transformative mechanism for understanding and reshaping society-ocean relationships. And ocean literacy over the last few years has really developed from early understandings around knowledge and education. But now we know that we sort of frame ocean literacy around these 10 dimensions. So I just wanted to touch on quickly how marine identity sort of interacts with these 10 dimensions of ocean literacy. I've already mentioned about emotions. The emotions are very, very strong in the concept of marine identity. Attitudes, these marine identity can influence the social acceptability of, for example, marine developments like offshore wind, and really influence how people think about different initiatives such as marine protected area establishment. So marine identity and attitudes are very interlinked, and related to that, relationships between marine identity and values and behaviours. And so marine identity can motivate local stewardship and the practice of care for the ocean based on that very strong interdependency between the self and the ocean. And also I've highlighted the ocean literacy dimension of activism. ocean sustainability issues, particularly issues around ocean degradation, they attract great attention from people with a strong marine identity and can motivate engagement in marine citizenship actions, such as campaigning for the ocean conservation, like an end to plastic pollution or an end to overfishing. Next slide, please, Alex. And so why is marine identity important? Why do we need to understand marine identity? And why are researchers like myself and many, many others, some of which I see are on this call, why are we investing time in trying to understand and explore the concept of marine identity? Well, understanding marine identity can encourage decision makers to actively consider the relationships that people have with the sea. As Kat mentioned, there's a very strong emphasis at the moment in marine planning processes. There's an over-reliance on economic values associated with the ocean, and that is becoming very sort of highlighted in common discourses around blue economy and blue growth, where decision makers are putting a lot of weight on the economic values of the ocean. But actually, by understanding marine identity, we can really start to reveal these more social and cultural relationships with the ocean and social cultural values of the ocean that are really, really crucial to embed in marine planning processes. Also, by understanding marine identity, we can really start to understand the roots of conflicts over marine identity, over marine developments. I mentioned before about offshore wind development and the fact that they can disrupt place-based relationships. And also, there might be some members of a community that are actually willing and embracing offshore wind developments because they see an opportunity for local jobs and socioeconomic development. And those different relationships and those different responses and the different levels of public acceptance really are a reflection of different types of marine identity. So by understanding marine identity, we can really start to unpick the roots of these conflicts and really try to move towards a more shared understanding of what the vision for ocean sustainability really means in different contexts. And what that means also, as I mentioned before, that marine identities can develop over a person's lifetime in response to changing social and cultural experiences and perhaps adverse experiences. It does mean that marine identity can vary amongst individuals in the same community. And again, that's really important for understanding how marine policies can affect different people with different aspirations and different relationships to the ocean. So from that perspective, understanding marine identity is really important, and it can help to provide a sort of leverage point, an entry point into influencing marine policy. So that's a sort of a very brief overview of marine identity, and it's a kind of novel concept to academia at the moment, and so as more and more interest develops in researching marine identity, perhaps if we were to come together in another few years, perhaps our understanding of marine identity would have evolved more, and I really hope that will be the case through different research that's going on right now. But that was just a sort of quick overview of marine identity as we understand it at the moment. And I'll hand over now to Alex, who will be sharing some of our experiences at a recent marine identity workshop, which we really, were the first steps for us as a way of engaging with people in the Connemara region in Ireland. And yeah, over to you, Alex, to the next stage of the webinar.
Great. Thank you very much, Lindsay. It's fascinating to get to hear about the concept of marine identity. And as you say, it is this novel concept and has only really recently been introduced into the academic lexicon. So it's really nice to get a chance to speak about it in this forum. So as Lindsay said, I'm going to give an overview of what we were doing in Connemara last month with a workshop that we organized there, focused on marine identity. But I wanted to take a step back before that and give a bit more context as to how we got to this point and what the project organizing all this is about. So as I said, here, talk a little bit about the Empower Us project, which I'm working on. talk about the specific workshop that we hosted in May, and I've outlined a few recommendations from our experience if anyone is interested in taking these ideas and hosting a similar event or activity in their own community. So to begin with, the Empower Us project is a Horizon Europe funded project, which brings together 16 partner organizations across Europe. So the full title is Socioeconomic Empowerment of Coastal Communities as Users of the Sea to Ensure Sustainable Coastal Development. And it started in the October 2022 and is ending this September 2025. So it's a European project that brings together coastal communities, academics, and local development institutions all around Europe with this common theme of trying to understand how coastal communities are adapting to change and what we as researchers from different fields can do in order to support those communities. So one of the lenses that we're looking at this through is the framing of transitional coastal labs, or TCLs. And so these are 6 essentially case study areas that we've set up in different areas around Europe. And we have, as shown here on the map, we have people in Bulgaria, Cyprus, Finland, Ireland, Norway, and Spain. And each of the transition coastal labs is set up as a partnership between an academic lead from a university, as well as a local partner from a local government agency or civil society organization. And so I've been working on the Ireland case study, which is focused on the Connemara and the Aran Islands region, specifically the Gaeltacht areas where they're speaking Irish as a community language. And our local partner is Údarás na Gaeltachta, who have a pre-existing interest in coastal community development and its intersection with language development and rural economic development and all these kind of various interests that they have. So a significant portion of work has gone in over the last 3 years looking at things around sustainable community economic development. And that has been the focus of pilot projects that have been developed in partnership between the academic leads and the local hosts. And so if you're interested in that side of the research, you can go to the Empower Us website and you can find more information about all of the different work that's being done there. But for today's purposes, we're specifically interested in the ocean literacy dimension of the work packages. And so as part of the project, when they were designing it, they wanted to embed ocean literacy as a core principle because we're working with coastal communities. And so each transition coastal lab was required to look at ocean literacy and think about how we can engage with the local communities in a productive way and create these ocean literacy activities. And so that was where the initial idea of a marine identity organized, focused workshop came about. Ocean literacy, I think, is a fantastic concept. And I think there is often a view of ocean literacy as being a sort of exchange from experts to non-expert users of knowledge. And there's a risk of scientists trying to disseminate information and only viewing it as a one direction. You know, we know about the ocean and we want to educate other people. And I think there's a place for that. But I think there's also a strong place for people whose lived experience and cultural identity is so bound up with the ocean that going and speaking to them about ocean literacy may not be the most productive approach. And so marine identity really came across as this concept where you get to start from the point of community members as already being experts on their personal relationship with the ocean. And so we thought it'd be very interesting to go down to a community in Connemara and speak to them about their experiences of the ocean and what it means to them. And so we organized a workshop in partnership with Údarás na Gaeltachta and with collaboration from the Irish Ocean Literacy Network in May 2020, or sorry, the 20th of May 2025. And we hosted it in Lettermullen in Connemara, which if anyone is familiar with Connemara, this is a map of it here. So it's about an hour's drive west of Galway City. And it is an absolutely beautiful area in Kentar na Nílan, which is a collection of islands connected by a single lane bridges. And we were able to host it at the Seaweed Center in Lettermullen, which is also the home of the Lettermullen and Grumna Heritage Center, which has a fantastic collection of local artifacts and pieces from the area, demonstrating the local heritage of the area, which, as you can imagine, is intricately bound up with the marine sector and the fishing and sailing and all of the history there. As this was hosted in a Gaeltacht community, it was important that it was held through the medium of Irish. As you can probably guess from Lindsay and I's accent, we are not native Irish speakers. And so it was important to us to be able to facilitate this in a way where we weren't forcing people to speak in English in order to try to communicate these deeply held ideas about themselves. And so we ended up arranging it for our colleague at Udros na Gaeltachta, led the discussions as a native Irish speaker, and most of the attendees were either native Irish speakers or had some level of proficiency in Irish. And for the benefit of the non-Irish speakers in the room, namely Lindsay and myself, we had staff from Udros na Gaeltachta present who were able to take notes during the event, and we received summaries of those notes after the fact. And so rather than trying to interrupt the actual workshop itself in order to get those reflections communicated to us in English, we thought we would observe from a more passive perspective and then receive the summaries afterwards. The workshop itself consisted of a combination of invited speakers and an open session. So we had people who were connected with coastal and marine development or worked in Vortis Gamara, the fisheries development agency, and the new Nuanamara, the new agency that's being set up to support marine sector development. So we had people with kind of a professional background in the marine sector, as well as people from the local area who reflected on their perspectives on how things are changing. And then we also had an open session for people from around the area and people who were connected to the Irish Ocean Literacy Network who had an interest in this topic. And I think importantly, we also were able to invite transition year students to join and share some of their perspectives as well. And it was really nice to get that kind of intergenerational exchange going during the discussions. So a few of the kind of themes and takeaways from these discussions. I think as anyone would expect, people living in a coastal community such as Lettermullen have a very strong, deep cultural connection to the sea, and this is illustrated through their identity, their language, the specific words that people have in Irish to describe coastal and marine words. Music, and we were very lucky to have one of the attendees sing a Sean Nose old style Irish song for us. And so many of those songs are influenced by the communities and individuals' experiences of the sea, and just this deep and rich kind of cultural connection, which really comes through. And people, both the invited speakers and the people in attendance, shared stories about growing up fishing, having their families involved in fishing, the boats that their families owned, the connections with people who emigrated, and how that influences their perspective of their local community. And again, it just showed how deeply this marine identity was interconnected with their own sense of self and their memories. One of the other themes that emerged from these discussions was the nature of the economic and environmental changes and pressures which coastal communities are experiencing. Fishing obviously was a significant industry for the area for a long time, and it still is in many ways, but it has declined relative to previous years. And speakers outlined the different challenges such as climate change and changing regulation and the changing markets for fish, and how that impacts both the jobs that people are able to do in the area, but then how that has a knock-on effect in terms of people's identity, in terms of their relationship with the work, and how that defines their relationship with their connection with the ocean. I think because we were able to hold the event at the Seaweed Center and Heritage Center, it was a very kind of tangible sense of heritage as connected to the ocean. And so a lot of people brought up this idea of how the ocean is so central to their identity, and it's a big part of their heritage and their cultural kind of representation. and people had stories about surfing, going out fishing, going rowing, having sailing races, all these various things from the local area, and how deeply integrated that was with their cultural identity. And then one of the kind of key points as well was this connection between generations, and how previous generations may have had a more direct connection through their work, seaweed harvesting or fishing or sailing, and how integrated they were with the ocean in so many ways, and how important it is to maintain that sense of marine heritage and carry that on, and how important it is to include younger people in order to pass it on that information and ensure that people still have an opportunity to connect with the ocean, even if the industries in which they're doing that has changed. So all in all, it was fascinating and really interesting insight into one community and their reflections on these areas. In terms of takeaways and my recommendations for if anyone was interested in replicating or hosting a similar kind of workshop, I think one of the key points is that place is incredibly important, and the interconnections between place and identity, especially when you're talking about something like marine identity, it really has a tangible impact. And so I think somewhere like the Seaweed Center in Lettermullen was a perfect location to host it. As I said, it made it very tangible, and you could go into the next room and pick up pieces of old ships and various points, things that have been collected from around the area, and you have that kind of hands-on idea of it. And so if you were interested in hosting this kind of event, I think it's worth thinking about, do we have it at a multi-purpose community hall that doesn't necessarily have any connection to the ocean, or can we host this in a place that has that more tangible connection? One of the things I thought was really valuable from the workshop as well was having people from different demographic groups represented, and particularly having people from different ages represented. So having the transition year students as well as older adults in the room really made for an interesting exchange. And someone's perspective as a 16-year-old and someone's perspective as a 60-year-old gets slightly different reflections. And it was great to have the transition year students in the room in order to have them share their stories. And many of them, I should mention that one of the things that we requested participants do is bring in some kind of tangible item or artifact to demonstrate their sense of marine identity. And some people brought in physical items, and some people brought in photos, and some people just told stories, and all of those were fantastic. But a lot of the transition year students actually brought in physical items in order to describe and explain their connection with the ocean. And so you had nails from boat building and oarlocks from an old boat, and all these things that people were able to relate to their family stories and have that kind of very physical demonstration of the marine heritage and marine identity as it played out for their own family. As I've already said, language was an important dynamic in our workshop, and depending on where you would be hosting a similar kind of event, you can determine what is the most appropriate approach. And obviously, if we were hosting an event in Dublin or Kilkenny, you may have a different kind of relationship with the Irish language, or English, or whatever your choice is. And so for our workshop, it made a lot of sense, because we were working in a Gaeltacht area, to have that opportunity to host it through Irish. But as I say, depending on your local area, it may make more sense to have it in English, or in other countries, whatever the local language is. And so think about what are you going to do in terms of translation and facilitation, and making sure that you have those opportunities for people to share in the language that is most reflective of their identity. One of the key points as well was providing space for sharing personal reflections. And I think having the first half of the session focused on presentations was quite valuable to get that kind of perspective from people who've worked in the sector professionally. But it was very important, I think, as well, to just have that open space for people to share their reflections, because everyone, regardless of what their title or background is professionally, they can have some kind of connection to the ocean, and it's worth hearing about that. And so having that kind of unstructured space for people to share was very valuable. And related to this, we thought about wanting to create an atmosphere for people to be able to share openly. And so we opted not to do a direct audio recording for the workshop, and instead did the note-taking approach in order to kind of capture the reflections of people. And I think there's a chance of, if people know that they're being recorded, it may influence the way in which they choose to express themselves. Maybe they don't feel as free to share things if they're worried about that it being transcribed verbatim and being attributable to them. And on the academic side, there's also ethical and data protection concerns there. So we decided to go with a note-taking approach, which provided a bit of space between individual reflections and the overall discussion. From an academic perspective, there's also a slight disadvantage to that, in as much as you may not have as much direct data being produced. But I think for this activity, it was really about enabling discussion and getting people to think about these concepts, rather than us trying to gather as much data as possible in order to produce papers or anything like that. So just to say that it's important to think about how you structure conversation, how you enable space for people to discuss things, and how you choose to record or reflect on those things, and recognizing that the way in which you're facilitating it and the way in which you might be recording it can impact the way in which people choose to engage. So that's it in terms of my reflections on the marine identity workshop that we hosted in May. I'll open the floor up now we'll move into a time for discussion and Q&A. As I was saying at the beginning, and some people may not have joined by this point, there is a Q&A function on the webinar. So if you're interested in submitting a question, but you don't want to speak out loud, feel free to submit through the Q&A function. We'll keep an eye on the chat as well if anyone has any comments. And I'm going to try to set it so that people can ask questions and use the microphone and camera as they choose, as they feel comfortable. It may take a minute to get that set up, because the automatic setting on the webinar is to mute all of the participants' microphones. So bear with me. If you have a question or comment and would like to start the discussion, please feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute people as they go. But I'm sure people have questions or their own reflections on things that we can get into. But just to kick things off, I thought I'd provide a few prompts. And so, what does marine identity mean to you? And is this a concept that feels tangible and understandable to you, even if it's not something you've heard of before? Do you feel like you have a marine identity? Is this something that resonates with you? And then I'd be interested in hearing, if you are thinking of, or even just hypothetically, if you were to host a marine identity workshop or activity in your community, who would you invite and where would you think would be a good place to host it? And then something more broadly to think about is how can the concepts of marine identity and ocean literacy come together and complement each other? I think, as Lindsay and Kat have already mentioned, I think they are very complementary concepts, but I'd be interested to hear people's reflections on that. So thank you very much for your time. I will close the presentation now. And as I say, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or raise your hand and I can unmute people individually. So thanks very much. So Lindsay and Kat, I don't know if, as people are deciding if they want to ask questions, I don't know if you have any personal reflections or any other points you would like to share.
Well, in my particular, I just want to say I really enjoyed the conference in Panama. I found it it was fantastic to see the transition of students stand up and speak so eloquently about what marine identity meant to them. Particularly, there was one student who stood up with the part of the boat, the last remaining part of his family's heritage and generations. And to him, the ocean wasn't this economic or job, it was part of his family and part of what was and no longer is. And that was just hugely like, wow. I also found it's, from my experience, it's something very particular in the Gaeltacht communities, because I live in Kildare in County Donegal. I've noticed that if you go into a bar or if you go into a meeting and someone starts to sing or someone starts to tell a story, everybody was quiet and everybody listens. And there was an element of listening almost immediately to it. And I think I could see when that student stood up to talk, everybody was quiet and everybody listened to what he had to say. And I don't think I've quite seen that in other places when I've seen other meetings going on. Quite often people talk over each other. One of the things I think is very particular to Irish language communities, that there's always an element of when someone's speaking about something or singing about something important, everyone listens. So I wonder how that would work in other communities around the coast, if there'd be something like that. But that was just something that brought to mind, in particular, how important it is to have it through the language of the area, and how I wonder how different it would be in other communities. So that's just my thought. Would anybody else like to ask any questions or?
Yeah, so there's one question in the chat here in the Q&A section. So I'll just read that out, and it's from Ashling. And it says, I'm wondering what the community's main frustrations were. Did you get a sense of what this community would like their future ocean relationship to look like? And I can start off, and then if Lindsay and Kat, if you have any points you'd like to carry on with. I think one of the main themes that came through from the people that we heard from was the frustrations with the decline of the fishing in the area. I think people have this very strong sense of attachment and connection between the fishing industry that obviously was very interconnected with the boat building and the sailing of the traditional Connemara hookers, and various small boats in the area. And you could really tell the pride and the passion that came through when people were talking about these specific boats and their connection to the local community. And so I think certain speakers were definitely very frustrated with the way in which the fishing industry has changed. And, for many people, they may not see that as a viable opportunity for younger generations to go into. I think it was interesting because, as with anything, you can't separate just the marine side of things from the rest of the world. And so there are other frustrations that people were communicating, which maybe weren't specifically about marine identity, but it was, these recurring issues that we're seeing in many places about housing and affordability, and people not being able to afford houses in their own areas. And there is an interesting kind of tension between, trying to develop a tourist economy, trying to provide accommodation, especially, self-catering accommodation, and having all of these Airbnbs available for rent in coastal areas, which then may have an impact on pricing out locals from being able to afford living in the area. And so there were definitely tensions there, and that also, feeds into that concern about, okay, it's great that we have the Wild Atlantic Way, it's great that we have these opportunities for tourism development, but is it also having these kind of longer term impacts on our communities, which we maybe didn't want? So those were the kind of things that came to mind from my understanding. Again, this was all filtered through the lens of notes that we received from the actual Irish speakers in the room. So there may have also been people in attendance who pulled away different takeaways than I have. But yeah, Lindsay and Kat, if you'd like to share any of your reflections on that.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I really picked up on, and I sort of touched on it a little bit in my overview of marine identity, was these opposing views around marine developments, particularly offshore wind. There was an offshore wind farm that had been planned there just off the coast there, and the project had been pulled literally a week before the workshop, and so it was still a very hot topic. And I really noticed how there were very different views around offshore wind developments amongst that group, and some people were very disappointed that the project had collapsed, and saw it as a way of, as I mentioned, about bringing in jobs. And there's a lot of concern about youth leaving the area because fisheries were in decline, and how do we provide a way and support youth to stay in the area and maintain that cultural and language heritage. And then there were other people in the group that were really glad that project had been pulled, and thought that it was obviously very disruptive to their marine identity. And the real sort of message to me there was about the sort of diversity of marine identities within a group of people that share a common background, to share a common culture, share a common language. And we can make these assumptions about coastal communities, and we sort of, there's a risk that we sort of homogenize coastal communities into this one entity and make assumptions that because people live close to the sea, they must have a certain kind of marine identity. And I think that was a big takeaway for me about how we really must pay attention to the real diversity of relationships, even within small geographic areas. And, you know, the relationships with seascapes are so diverse. And I think that is something that, you know, we really need to sort of advocate with decision makers and policy makers to take that into consideration into marine policy making. And just to add a small thing then about the language side of things, because as you mentioned, Alex, you know, you and I were not able to understand the discussions that went on. But what was so powerful for me as a participant was that even though I couldn't understand the language, it was almost like I didn't need to. The marine identities were so tangible and real in that room that I thought that was really yeah, very, very profound. And it made me sort of really realize that marine identity is a real thing, and it's really something that, you know, we need to pay more attention to in terms of our kind of ocean literacy networks and our, you know, our community of marine social scientists, but also really sort of, as I said, advocate with policymakers about you know, how important understanding marine identities are.
Absolutely. So I have just, yeah, Kat, would you like to say something? Not sure. I just saw that you unmuted, so I wanted to give you a chance. But yeah, let me know if you'd like to. One more point that's been raised here in the Q&A section is talking about how there can be a tension between people who live in coastal communities and are indirectly connected to marine activities, but they can sometimes find it difficult to articulate their marine identity. And the question is asking if we had any kind of reflections on this potential kind of emotional conflict or tension or difficulty in terms of people expressing themselves and their relationship with the ocean. So personally, I think it didn't come through so much in the workshop. I think people there, because they knew what the topic of the workshop was, they may have come in with a slight understanding of the topic. But certainly in my research, when I've been going around Connemara and speaking with people, you know, we've been framing it through the lens of coastal community development. And you may speak to people who work in coastal communities on islands, and they may not necessarily think of themselves as working in coastal community development because, you know, to them, it's just their community. And it's almost goes without saying that that is, of course, the context that they're working in. And so I do think that marine identity has a benefit in terms of bringing that to the fore and getting people to directly engage with the concept. You know, if you've grown up in a coastal area and you take it for granted that that's just your reality, it may be harder to get to express yourself in that kind of direct way. But Lindsay and Kat, I don't know if you have any reflections on that as well.
Can I just point that there's a hand up?
Oh,
Seamus is.
Yes, Seamus. Yeah, great to see you again.
Yeah, good. Excuse me. I've just, you know, someone was speaking about ORE there. I'm just taking a break from a seafood ORE meeting online with I'm a part of the seafood ORE working group, so I just took a break to come to some more lighter topic than seafood ORE and all that entails. Just my reflections on the day in Lettermullen. I thought it was a very good example of how coastal what people think of the coastal community. I'm a native of Carna. I've lived here for most of my life, and I've been a fisherman. I'm sort of as my son calls me now, you're just the shore manager for the fishing boat. But it was interesting, Kat there referred to, the different views that we have in the coastal community. I'd be one of the people that would be, from the fishing point of view, I'd be sort of optimistic I could be optimistic one day and pessimistic another day. I'm a member of the National Inshore Fishermen's Association, and I saw the last message there. We need, in Ireland especially, and I'm a bit of knowledge about the UK down around Cornwall, we need our inshore fisheries to be more respected and more regarded in Ireland. When you refer to fishing in Ireland, it's referred to the big trawlers. I think I said that the day I was talking. We need a bit more respect for the coastal communities as well. But the coastal communities are diverse, as mentioned earlier as well. I have a strong sense of a marine identity. Anyone that knows me, I think the second thing they would come to think of is fishing or sailing, and my family and my community, the same strong sense of fishing, maritime identity. Be they not fishing, they might have their forefathers were fishing. But the biggest question, and it was raised that day, and it was raised again today, is the threats to these coastal communities. The threat and housing was mentioned, and that is a real threat in Connemara and probably in all coastal communities. I'm quite familiar with all the coast around Ireland. That is a problem, keeping our youth. We have 3 kids, or they're adults now, and none of them are at home, though my son comes home every 2 weeks because he skippers a trawler. And the opportunities aren't there. Even if the opportunities were there tomorrow morning, if a miniature Dell or some one of those companies dropped into us tomorrow morning, none of the local people could take work in it, because you can't build a house here. I built my house 40 years ago. Now, where my house is designated special area conservation. So my son wanted to build next door to me, and before he'd lay a block, he was talking about the guts of €100,000. Planning, environmental impact assessments. So that discourages people, and if I want to buy, if he wanted to buy some of the local houses for sale, he would be outbid by people from, more often than not, from Dublin. I can give you an example. A shack out my road, person lived in for years and years. It went over €400,000. The person that's built that bought it has demolished it and is building. I think he's spending the guts of €7,000 or €8,000. So they're the threat to the coastal community. But all along the Irish coast, there's always a strong sense of our maritime and our marine identity. As I said that day below, I sort of diverted from fishing, through sailing, through sea sports, and I was very impressed that day with the kids from the local secondary school. And the reason I was impressed, because and I know the principal quite well, I wouldn't say he insists, but he promotes the interest in the maritime by having sailing classes, talking, and the kids he brought in, and I was very impressed, because and I think some of them maybe were a bit too shy to speak in public. They probably spoke to him privately, but they were all interested. Their dad may be a fisherman, their granddad may be a boatwright, granddad may be a sailor or a skipper of a Galway hooker, something like that. And you see, the principal of that school promotes that. The ethos of the school promotes it. Where my kids went to school here in Carna, that has not been promoted. There's no ethos being promoted. Some of the kids, I remember I was working for Bord Iskewara maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and we gave a small bit of grant aid money to the local sailing school. And I just happened to get the names of the kids. And this shows you the sort of, not the disinterest, but the sort of people didn't know their heritage. I was able to tell some of the young kids there that their granddad was a fisherman, or their great granddad was a well-known fisherman. And I remember one of the parents coming to me, said, "How did you know that?" And the kid was delighted to find out that his great granddad was a fisherman. So you have to build, you know, when I was growing up years and years ago, we had nothing else to do until we started the age to play football. You know, we were rowing, we were out in our corrock, we might have a lobster pot or two out, and my granddad was a fisherman. And he encouraged that. No, although my dad encouraged us to go to secondary school and go to university, etc., but he did that as well. That's my reflections on the day. And I was really impressed with the young people. I was, you know, actually, I was delighted, you know, with their input and their interest. And it's all a credit to the school and to their parents. And you know, my wife down it was a teacher, and she just gets, when my son comes home, you know, and she says, the 2 year there in the conservatory, and you're talking about nothing else but fishing, you're fishing in Alaska or something like that. So that's I'm going a bit too far, too long. So it was very impressive. It was very, very impressive. And over those occasions in coastal areas, and tied in with the Irish language as well, which is another part of our identity. So we have the maritime, the Irish language, and the culture and the history of both. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing. And yeah, it was great to have you there on the day, and nice to hear your reflections as well. I think that's it in terms of the time we have for the discussion. So I will pass it over to Kat if you have any final comments or anything you'd like to say to close. And I'll say thank you very much for everyone for attending.
I just want to echo what Seamus said. Completely resonated with me because it's very much similar to what's happening up here in Donegal and County Kildare. And it's so important, and it's so invigorating to see students, children, really realizing how incredible the marine area is, how incredible the marine home is, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of cultural history. And this is something I think we need to put on. We need to acknowledge from the elders and facilitate some way to pass it on to the generations to come. And this is one of the things that the Education Literacy Network tries to do through the Education Working Group. I just want to sum up and say thank you all so very much for being here today. It was great to hear all the different viewpoints. Related to the IOLN, we have 2 campaigns at the moment. We actually have a campaign called Mine Oceans, where we basically ask people, what does the ocean mean to you? And we would like to hear from people within this group, what does the ocean mean to you? It can be a short prose, it can be a poem, it can be an image, anything and anything. We're just trying to capture people's emotional connections to the ocean. And another thing that we're doing is we also have a survey on activism, as in what motivates people like the people in this group to act for the ocean. Why do you do what you do? Why do you work to protect it? Why do you work to pass your heritage on, or knowledge about biodiversity, any of this sort of thing? And we're capturing all of this information to better facilitate the work of the IOLN and to build the capacity of the members of the IOLN. So if anybody would like to know more about the Mine Oceans or the survey, please just email me and I can send you any of the information. But thank you all so very much for being here today. This is something that I'm finding I'm very passionate about, really. And it was lovely to hear so many other people who are the same. Okay. Do you want to finish up, Alex?
I'll just reflect that and say, yeah, thank you very much to everyone who attended, and thanks very much for the questions and comments in the chat. It was really wonderful to get to hear from everyone, and hopefully if this inspires anyone to take on these ideas and replicate the workshop or anything similar, please feel free to get in touch with any of us. I think our contact information is available through the sign-up sheet. So please feel free to reach out if you have any interest in following up on this. So yeah, thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.